Rated M for mature.
Hello and welcome to a special video podcast of the Bethesda podcast. This month marks the 20th anniversary of id Software's seminal first-person shooter, Wolfenstein 3D. To commemorate the occasion, we've released a browser version of the game at wolfenstein.bethsoft.com. You can also get it on the official Wolfenstein Facebook page.
And I'm Nick Brecken. We caught up with id Software's John Carmack, who was there from the beginning as Wolfenstein 3D's lead programmer. John was not only more than eager to share his memories of Wolfenstein, but also sat down to play the original DOS version of the game and provide a special commentary track. So we hope you enjoy.
You know, I actually had a great time just a couple years ago dragging Wolfenstein out for the iOS version, where I hadn't really looked at it for over a decade probably prior to that. And, the core essence of what's in a first-person shooter, of navigating around the environment, picking stuff up, and shooting at your enemies, really was there from the very beginning. And obviously, it's amazing how far we've come. You could look at the old 320 by 200 graphics in 256 color VGA and compare it with today's games. But, the core essence of taking an experience that used to just be done in top-down. We were all familiar at the time with top-down shooters like Gauntlet and things where you would run around and shoot at the enemies there, and taking really very similar gameplay and projecting it into the 3D environment with perspective. And the fact that changed the way you perceived and experienced the game so much was the real triumph of what we did then. The evolution of our first-person experience started with a game called Hover Tank, which was like Catacombs 3D and Wolfenstein, a 3 degree of freedom game where you could move around in X, Y, and rotate, but it had flat shaded walls, so they were just like red and green blocks on there, but it did have the scaled bitmaps for the enemies. Then we went to Catacombs 3D, which had the texture mapped walls as well as the scaled enemies, but it was really the absolute minimal case for that, where there was nothing but a world full of blocks. There were some blocks that you could make disappear to kind of simulate doors. The enemies always faced you, and it was pretty much just the mob of enemies. They would just target down on your position and home in on you. It was still pretty neat, but with Wolfenstein, we wanted to add several more key things to it. We added the doors as an element which moved a little bit away from the blocks where they were pushed in halfway through there. We added enemies that could be seen from different angles. They weren't really 3D, but they had 8 different rotations, some of which were mirror flips, which also allowed us to have enemies that would walk around through the world. And in fact, that's something that we sort of lost a bit when we moved to Doom, where in Wolfenstein we've got all these guys moving around on paths, and you get more of an opportunity to sneak up behind people and to kind of know that you dodged an encounter by seeing them walk right past you without quite noticing you. And that had several pretty neat aspects to it. So we knew that we wanted to do some of these types of gameplay enhancements, more weapons, and more things to pick up and all the obvious stuff. But after we had done Catacombs, we thought that the first thing that we were going to do the game called It's Green and Pissed. It was just going to be an aliens game with most of the enhancements that we wanted to do in Wolfenstein, and it was only later that we kind of latched onto the idea of taking this favored old Apple II game theme, the Wolfenstein, Return to Castle Wolfenstein theme. And it was a wonderful thing a year or two later when we got to see Silas Warner, the original author of the Apple II Castle Wolfenstein game, at one of the Apple II Kansas Fests that Romero and Tom and I went to, and have him kind of give us his blessing for approval of the game that we did there. That was really great. So technology-wise, the 2 previous 3D games, the Hover Tank and Catacombs 3D, I had done those in an object space sort of rendering where it drew limited polygons. They're one-dimensional in terms of they were just line segments on there that were restricted to axial on there, but it had something that resembled a polygon rasterizer and a polygon clipper, and those were both done in 4 to 6 weeks apiece, and I had really quite a bit of difficulty with it. And again, going back in time 20 years, there weren't all of the references and existence proofs and tutorials on all of this, and I was having a hard time getting some of that stuff to be as robust and reliable as it needed to be. And you could get a few freak out cases in Catacombs 3D, and one of my real goals was to simplify it enough that it would be really rock solid and robust. And the fact that it came out to also be a speed up was more comment on the poor quality of my previous implementation, because when Wolfenstein needed to gain some speed on much poorer platforms like the Super Nintendo, I went back to more of a rasterization approach with BSP trees rather than raycasting on there. But Wolfenstein did wind up being both more efficient and more robust than my previous implementations. But this was, this was all Wild West for me back then. I was figuring it all out as I went along, and there weren't a lot of things to kind of look at as examples. I seem to remember that we had the first one running in about 3 months. We followed it up with Spear of Destiny on there before moving on to Doom, but it was a very short amount of time. We leveraged the tool sets that we were using to create the 2D games, the Commander Keen series, where we had a good tile editor that John Romero had developed, and since the Wolfenstein maps were basically simple tile maps, we were able to kind of make things happen really quickly on that, and also the maps were just so quick to create. We had several maps in shipping products that were literally done in one day. Somebody would go scrub out a map, we'd play it a bunch of times, tweak things a little bit, and it would go into the project there. And it's always interesting looking back at the games there, where you look at the source code and like it all fits in one directory. It's a handful of C files and a few ASM files, and there's just not that much to it. When we look at what we're doing today, and it seems that we can't throw a dialogue up on the screen without invoking 10 different frameworks and 50,000 lines of code. So the thing that stands out a lot was the first, and it influenced a lot of what id Software did afterwards, was the first sense of people kind of tweaking with the projects there. You had people figuring out how to unpack the levels, and that wasn't straightforward because we were trying to fit on floppy disks at this time, so I had to develop all of this compression technology. And of course, the funny thing is, in hindsight, I had sort of independently reinvented LZSS and Huffman coding in different cases in very ad hoc ways. And people figured all of these out, extracted everything, and started making character editors and and level editors. And neither of those were designed to be done, and they weren't straightforward. The characters were in this column-packed format that that made it more efficient to draw without transparency tests, but made it really difficult to figure out what these original pictures looked like. So people started doing these really neat things with it, and once we just recognized that there was a large body of people that wanted to do this, that influenced a lot of our future decisions in Doom and Quake about making it actually easy and straightforward and encouraging people to undertake those things. And I have clear recollections to this day, and especially at that time, about thinking back when I was getting into gaming when I was a teenager, about how I wish that I could have that kind of access to the inside and guts of the games that I played. I can remember breaking out the Apple II sector editors to give myself lots of gold in Ultima 3 and that type of stuff, and and wishing that I had the ability to look at the source code for those old titles, and being able to make that type of thing come true as we were able to later release the full source code as well as the modding tools for the games has been something that I'm really proud of in my career. So one of the things that I used to insist on in the old games was that you should be able to launch the game and just bang enter a few times to get in and be playing the game. And that's something that I think it's a little bit of a shame nowadays that we have to go through so many logo crawls, and of course we're trying to preload things and do effective stuff in that time, but I was always about getting into the games as quickly as possible, being able to go in and see what the game's about and have fun really quickly. So another thing, in the early days when we were more looking at the Return to Castle Wolfenstein Apple II game, which was much more of a stealth game, we had the ability, like you did in the original, to drag bodies around so the guards wouldn't see them. So I can still look at that body and clearly remember the time when you could go over, hit a key, and drag it with you to some out-of-the-way place. But as we got on, we found out that the game was just much, much more fun to be guns blazing than to be sneaking around. And that's really a lesson that gets relearned continuously as the industry's evolved. One of the things that was always a little bit annoying in the original game was how slidey everything was around the doors, and in some other versions later on, it would actually pocket in there so that you could find your way a little bit easier. I remember the push for saying that we wanted to get something else and couldn't we do something like the doors, and that certainly was a little bit on the ugly side in the code, and the way it was hacked in with the ray tracers, but it was certainly a worthwhile thing, although you had so many people that would just play the game with their nose scrubbing up against the wall like this. So it is interesting. I have lots of memories of the later versions of the games, where, especially in this room, when I did the Atari Jaguar version, I remember finding that in this room, looking at about this way, I could actually go 60 frames per second, which was, unseen before in 3D gaming, and it was so cool, but of course I couldn't hold it for the rest of the game and I had to lock it down at 30 frames per second, but that's still one thing that I clearly remember about that part of that room, just feeling that silky smooth 60 hertz gameplay, while on the PC we were still struggling along like this is in the teens for the most part. I personally did, of course, the PC version and the Super Nintendo version and the Jaguar version, and then we had Wolfenstein, kind of like Doom, is just anything that's got a CPU has a version of Wolfenstein on it since we had the open source versions. But we had official versions on the Mac which had higher quality graphics made, and a few of the other platforms, the Archimedes or the Acorn Risk Machine, several other things that we had licensing agreements with. Now, that was another thing on the Super Nintendo version. Of course, you can't shoot dogs in a Nintendo game, at least back then, so the dogs had to be changed to evil, German rats, to go along with the fact that the blood had to be changed to green because, you can't actually shoot people, so they had to be some kind of aliens wearing human uniforms or something. And so, of course, back here we're dealing with, this was our first game with digitized sound effects. The music is still frequency modulated ad-lib synth, but we had digital sound effects in here. And this was working with Bobby Prince for the music and creating all the sound effects for us. And that was pretty cool back in the days. If you had the ad-lib, you just got these squirrely, not so interesting little beeps on there. But if you had the Sound Blaster, you got the digitized sound effects. Yeah, there's two graphical glitches. Like one that I just saw there is there was a missing column as I hit the push wall. And then occasionally, as I'm moving around, I may notice one stretched column that shows up. As two of the things that they were constrained in that they wouldn't cause crashes or difficulties on there. Although actually here you can see one of the graphical artifacts where the normally when you're a decent distance from things, everything smoothly expands on there, but if you notice when you get up close and they start going off the edge of the screen, you start getting more quantization in that. And that's a result of the fact that the core graphics technology behind the texture mapping in this time frame was compiled scalars, where there's actually a different little section of assembly language code that was programmatically generated to draw a 64 tall piece of graphics, 2 pixels tall, 4 pixels tall, 6 pixels tall, and so on, all the way up to the full height of the screen. But it started taking up too much memory and it would run out in a 640K system if I let them stretch all the way up to the largest possible scale that you'd get there in steps by one. So it started taking some shortcuts and saving a little bit as it got bigger. Another interesting thing in the time frame of Wolfenstein was we were still very strongly influenced by arcade games and the arcade tradition, and all of our previous games with Commander Keen and the games we had done at Softdisk, they still had the concept of lives, as if you're putting quarters in. You get 3 tries and then you have to put another quarter in, and it was only with Doom where we made the real realization obvious in retrospect that you're not at an arcade, you just want to play the game to have fun, and we finally gave away the concept of lives. But in Wolfenstein, you still had, one-ups hidden some places, and you had to, in theory, get through the game without losing all of your lives. And there were still the rewarding times in the game of the secret rooms with the acres of bonus items that you get to run over. So I still regret the fact that we were a little late to the game on iOS. When it first came out, I pitched that we should move Orcs and Elves, one of our successful feature phone titles, over there, and we got something up and running, but we couldn't pull the trigger on actually turning it all the way into a product. And it was only so it was over a year after the iPhone came out when I finally got down and said that I wanted to go and actually try out the first-person shooter stuff on there. And I think it was less than a month that it wound up taking me. A lot of that was learning the ins and outs of iOS. Cass Everett had helped me kind of get a framework up and going there. And then it was interesting to figure out what base I wanted to work with, where the original Wolfenstein 3D was 16-bit code and had a lot of x86 assembly language. It didn't have C kind of fallback paths for any of that. This was before we had discovered cross-platform development and all of those, the benefits of doing things that way. So it would have been a chore to go rewrite it, although again, it's not that much code. I could have gone in and, literally gone over every line of the code in not too terribly long. But this was open source and the internet to the rescue, where after I had released the original Wolfenstein source code, a number of people had gone and done additional work on top of it, and somebody had made a nice 32-bit clean version of the game that was portable, used OpenGL for graphics, and it made the task of getting it onto iOS a lot easier, although interestingly he had introduced a couple new bugs to the game that weren't there in the original one, that when I was debugging things I would see some enemy behavior, enemies shooting through the world that turned out to be a bug in the conversion from 16-bit to 32-bit. Right. It was that was a fun project, and then after that, doing Doom Classic was also a whole lot of fun. Going back and doing the things that many years ago. I mean, I remember how challenging it all was way back then. And of course, in retrospect, with 20 years of experience going through different things, you know how you should do things, or how you should have done it back in the past. Probably even more so with Doom, where having done a number of versions of Doom over the years, I knew exactly how I really should have structured the loop, especially for a hardware-accelerated game. But yeah, going back, one of the funny things, or interesting at least, in the case of Wolfenstein and really all of our games to some degree, is that when we're actually making the games, I usually haven't thoroughly played through every level in the game during development. I'm all busy going through the same levels over and over again, working out problems, optimizing things. And I can remember during the Jaguar Wolfenstein development, when I was all happy with it running at a nice 30 frames per second, good performance, and I was just saying, wow, this is really lots of fun. And Romero gave me the kind of snarky comment about, yeah, it was lots of fun in the PC version too, you just didn't play that one that much. And I see that even on some of the later games, where even on some things that I'm working on now, when we go back and look at previous games, I'll notice things that that have been there forever, but I just never picked up on them the first time through. It is still interesting. It's like, I'm sure a modern gamer that didn't come up through the generations of all of it might be a little hard pressed to see what the fuss was all about. But especially if you took one of the versions that was running at a high frame rate and had good responsiveness responsive controls on there, you could still get the same basic vibe. And again, I think that the Jaguar version was probably my favorite because you had shoulder buttons to be able to move around on, so you get the strafing action more easily in there. It ran at a consistent frame rate. Things were a little bit crisper in some ways. So I had a lot of fun on that, and I think that somebody today would have a similar sense to going back and looking at a game like Defender or Robotron, one of the classic arcade games that you can still kind of see the fun in today. But it's also clear, obviously, it's hard to find examples of anything else where you have progressed as much as we have in here when we look at the delta from Wolfenstein to Rage and you put them side by side. And it's true that I literally couldn't have imagined 20 years ago what we would be able to do in the games today, like, what Rage could look like, because computer-generated graphics in the movies 20 years ago didn't look as good as what we do real-time in the games now. That sense of 6 orders of magnitude of progress, a factor of 1,000,000 that we're using to do really sort of the same basic game. You run around, you pick stuff up, you engage your enemies and defeat them and move on to the next level, but we're throwing 1,000,000 times more power at it now than what we had here. And it's pretty good use for it. It makes the games are a whole lot better. They're more interesting in all sorts of ways. One of probably the gameplay thing that I most remember in Wolfenstein as a positive sense is when you wind up going through a door and there's an SS right on the other side with the machine gun, and you're pumping the machine gun shots into them, and they're doing the side-to-side twitch back and forth, as that's my quintessential Wolfenstein moment. My quintessential Doom moment is the imp getting a face full of blood bursts from a shotgun, but most games have that thing that I associate with the action there. And Wolfenstein had a lot of good play value in it. There were a lot of levels because they were easy to create, and quite a bit of play time through it. And then, of course, when people started making their own levels, you had as much of it as you could possibly want to play. It's been a long road on a technical side, certainly the results, but also what we wind up doing to go through and make it. And it's interesting to go back and see how much we were able to accomplish with so little, because in many cases there's so much waste that's endemic in development, both in how you spend your time, how you spend your resources, for what you get out of it. And when we look back at what we were able to do in a small number of months with a single directory full of code files, and how much enjoyment we were able to give people out of it, it's a little bit of a cautionary tale about just how everything seems to take a schedule of meetings and a plan and a framework of objects, and sometimes you wind up just spending a whole lot of work for things that could probably have been done in a simpler fashion and wind up achieving similar goals. And I think that any big company doing AAA development now on a multi-year cycle, there is something that they've lost by not having the mad dash to get something done in a small number of months, to be able to find the real value and get it into a space where it can be tested and improved upon. It's a conscious trade. The magnificent, majestic things that we do today just aren't possible to hack together, but the fun core elements of things aren't the ones that take a man-century of effort like so many of the big things do. And I think it's good to be reminded every now and then of that the essence isn't necessarily in what you throw the man centuries and the huge human waves of things at.